The first reading comes from Daniel 7, 9 to 10, and 13 to 14. This passage first of all speaks about the Ancient One. This is Yahweh, whose clothing is bright as snow, his hair on his head is white as wool. This is the first reading, which is always a preparation for the Gospel when there are three readings. In this case, God the Father is presented as the one who is luminous, who is filled with glory. In the Gospel, we'll see Jesus have those same attributes, therefore saying that Jesus is what Yahweh is, God. We hear about a Son of Man coming down from heaven. Now, in Daniel 7, the Son of Man referred to the Jewish people. They were living through a difficult period in their history. They were being persecuted, and this passage promises them that they will receive dominion and glory and kingship over all the nations of the earth. At the time of Jesus, however, the phrase Son of Man seems to be recycled and used for an individual, the Messiah, rather than the Jewish people. And Jesus uses that phrase for himself. He doesn't call himself Messiah, doesn't call himself Lord. He calls himself Son of Man, referring to Daniel 7. But whenever he calls himself Son of Man, he also borrows vocabulary taken from the songs of the suffering servant in Deutero-Isaiah, which speak about a mysterious figure who would suffer and die for the sins of the people. So, being Son of Man, Jesus not only receives power and authority, but he also receives a cross. The second reading is from 2 Peter 1, 16 to 19. Now, the second letter of Peter probably was not written by Peter. In fact, we believe that it might be the last book of the New Testament to have been written, around 120 AD. But it was written in the name of Peter. This was a very common technique in the early church and the ancient world as a whole, to write a book and to attribute it to another author to gain that author's authority. In this passage, the author speaks about having heard the voice from heaven saying, "This is my Son, my beloved one, with whom I am well pleased." That having been present at the Transfiguration, it shows that the message that he gives about Jesus is true. It's not one of those cleverly devised myths. Already in the early church around 120 AD, we have some Gnostic tendencies developing in which they speak about all sorts of strange celestial and cosmic events that have nothing to do with the person of Jesus. This author is trying to say that the message that they proclaimed is the true message. And it speaks about being a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns. The day would be that day when Jesus would return in glory, and the morning star rises. The morning star is Venus. Now later on, the Blessed Virgin Mary would be given the term the morning star, because the morning star arises before the dawn, just as Mary arose before the birth of Jesus. But in the New Testament, the phrase morning star refers to Jesus himself, because Venus is the goddess of love and of victory, and Jesus had a victory of love over death just before the dawn when he rose from the dead. The Gospel is from Mark 9, 2 to 10. We hear about how Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, the three important apostles, up a high mountain. Now, the mountain is never named, but traditionally it's said to be Mount Tabor. There he transfigures, very similar to the description we heard about the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. We hear about Jesus, and Elijah and Moses appear. Elijah, the prophet, Moses, the law. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Now, these two characters were also important because Elijah was taken up into heaven in a fiery chariot, and Moses was buried by God himself. In New Testament times, when authors would write about the secrets of heaven, especially in apocalyptic books, they would attribute those books most often to Moses, to Elijah, or to Enoch, who walked with God and then was no more. Moses and Elijah being present means that Jesus is the fulfillment of that apocalyptic hope. Jesus has destroyed the distance between us and heaven. And the very fact that he's transfigured in the midst of these three apostles means that heaven is reigning upon the earth. What does the voice from the heavens say? This is my beloved Son, listen to him. Jesus is not simply Son of God, he's the beloved Son, like that beloved Son of the songs of the suffering servant. Peter wants to make 3 tents for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. Remember how in the Old Testament the Ark of the Covenant dwelt in that tent of meeting? Well, now this holiness that Peter is seeing is to be housed in these tents. But Peter doesn't fully understand. This is beyond their understanding. It's an experience of the holiness of God that can only be understood in the light of the Holy Spirit after Pentecost. In fact, when Jesus tells the disciples as they go down the mountain, don't tell anybody about what you've seen until the Son of Man has risen from the dead, they're confused because they don't even understand what he's saying when he says the Son of Man would rise from the dead. And may God bless us.